Why was everyone ignoring her at the briefing table? The room buzzed with clipped voices, paper maps rustling, the faint hum of the projector. Men leaned forward in their chairs, tossing sharp questions, marking circles on screens, debating ranges and angles. But when she spoke, measured, precise, offering an alternative nobody else had seen, they didn't even flinch. Her words dissolved in the air. She pressed her lips together, a slow exhale. She had learned long ago not to demand their attention, not in this room, not in this world where silence was mistaken for weakness, where calm eyes were read as hesitation. And yet, her plan was the only one that would work. She lowered her gaze, fingers tracing the ridges of the steel water bottle in front of her, as if the cool metal might anchor her. The briefing moved on without her, chatter layering over itself, until the commander, tired, jaw set, cut through the noise. "Fine, we'll go with standard approach." She felt it then, that subtle twist in her chest, the ache of being unseen. But there was something she hadn't told them, not yet. Not about the quiet hours she had spent studying every contour of the valley on her own. Not about the glint of an antenna she had noticed on satellite footage, hidden, small, but there. Not about the pattern in enemy movements that suggested a trap. She swallowed the truth like bitter medicine, because timing mattered. And timing was something she understood better than anyone. The hangar smelled of fuel and dust. Planes lined up in shadows, their metal skin gleaming under fluorescent lights. She walked between them with her helmet under one arm, boots echoing against concrete, each step slow, deliberate. She wasn't flying tonight, not this mission. But she would be close, watching from the ridge, rifle steady, waiting for the smallest flicker of movement, waiting for proof. The others thought of her as the backup, the add-on, the quiet one in the corner with sharp eyes. They didn't know how many hours she had spent in deserts and cities, how many nights without sleep, how many times she had walked away with blood in her hair that wasn't her own. They didn't ask and she didn't tell. She paused at the edge of the hangar, watching one of the younger soldiers check his gear. He was barely 20, his hands shaking as he tried to snap his vest into place. His lips moved silently, rehearsing some prayer or maybe just counting numbers to calm himself. She wanted to tell him it was okay to be afraid. That fear didn't make him less. That fear was the thing that kept you alive. But she said nothing, only adjusted the strap of her pack and kept walking. Silence had become her language. Later, when the convoy rolled out, the night air was thick and restless. Heat still clung to the earth, but a chill whispered at the edges, creeping down from the mountains. She sat in the back of the lead vehicle, rifle case at her side, eyes scanning the darkness. The men beside her joked quietly, throwing words back and forth to mask their nerves. A story about a girl back home, a complaint about food, the kind of fragile laughter soldiers carried like armor. She didn't join in, but she listened, always listened. Because she remembered a time, years ago, when laughter had been her own shield. Before the desert, before the dust, before the sound of mortar fire had carved itself into her sleep. And before the choice that had sent her here on this road to this mission. The road narrowed into the valley, walls of rock rising sharp on either side. Their headlights cut thin beams across jagged edges, shadows leaping like restless spirits. She shifted in her seat, her gut tightened. Something was wrong. She leaned forward, eyes narrowing, searching the slopes. There, a shimmer, almost invisible like a thread of spider silk caught in the light, too deliberate. A wire. Her voice sliced through the hum of the engine. "Stop." The driver froze, boots slamming the brake. The convoy lurched to a halt, dust billowed, swallowing them whole. "What is it?" someone barked. She pointed, steady finger raised toward the ridge. The men squinted, fumbling for binoculars. One cursed under his breath. And then they saw it. The glint of metal, the shape half buried in dirt, an IED waiting for their wheels. The silence was sharp now, no laughter, no chatter, only the thud of hearts, the rasp of breath. She met the driver's eyes, young, pale, trembling. She gave a small nod, calm, steady, the kind of nod that said, "You're alive because we stopped, because I saw what you didn't." But she didn't say the words out loud. The commander's voice crackled through the radio tense. "Detour. Now we move quiet, watch everything." The convoy shifted, engines rumbling low, wheels grinding against stone as they backed out, turned sharp and found another path. She leaned back, pulse steadying but her mind racing. They would think it was luck, sharp eyes, nothing more. But she knew that antenna she had spotted days ago wasn't just an anomaly. Someone was watching. Someone had placed this trap exactly where they knew soldiers would pass. And if she was right, this was only the beginning. Yeah. Hours later, she lay flat against the cold ground of the ridge, rifle braced, cheek pressed to stock. The night stretched wide around her, stars sharp above, the valley dark below. Every sound mattered, the chirp of insects, the scrape of stone, the distant growl of an engine too far to see. Her breath slowed, her heartbeat matched the rhythm of the scope's crosshairs. She had learned this art in silence, not from textbooks, not from trainers who doubted her, but from the long days she had spent in places no one remembered, places where waiting was the only weapon you had. Through the glass she caught it, a flicker of movement, a figure, slipping between rocks. Too fast, too careful, not a farmer, not a wanderer. She tracked him, steady hands guiding the barrel. But she didn't fire, not yet. Because something inside her whispered, "Not him, not now, wait." She swallowed the tension, let the figure vanish into shadows and stayed still. The wind tugged at her hair where it escaped beneath her cap. Her lips parted just slightly, pulling air in slow. And as she waited, her mind drifted. Back to a different night. Back to the voice on the phone, shaking, her brother's words before his final deployment. He had promised to come back, promised she'd see him again. He hadn't. And every mission since had carried his shadow. Every shot she lined up, every silent moment, every ignored voice at a briefing table. It was all for him. Yeah. Down below, headlights flickered, foreign, wrong, moving against the rhythm of local roads. Her pulse quickened. She whispered into the radio, her voice low, almost fragile but steady enough to cut through static. 2 vehicles, East Ridge. No lights except when turning, they're not locals. The line crackled, then stilled. "Copy that," the commander replied. His tone carried a new weight now, an edge of respect he hadn't given in the briefing room. She didn't smile, didn't relax. Because respect was fleeting, and survival demanded more than acknowledgement. Through the scope she tracked the vehicles, waited for proof, for a choice, for the second when silence would break. The ridge was colder now, the wind sharper, her cheek numb against the rifle's frame, but she didn't move, didn't blink. Because sometimes dignity doesn't speak. It waits. And when it acts, everything changes. How long could she hold her breath before doubt set in? The vehicles below crawled along the ridge like predators, engines rumbling low, deliberate. No dust, no headlights, every move calculated. Whoever drove them knew the land as well as she did. Her finger hovered near the trigger guard, not touching, not committing. A choice lived in the space between stillness and action. One shot now could unravel the mission. One hesitation could cost lives. She listened. The valley carried sound differently at night, amplified, distorted. Tires crunching over gravel, a door creaking. A man's cough, short, contained, the kind you made when you didn't want to be heard. Her breath slid out in a thin stream. She steadied her scope. 2 men stepped into the open, shadows only at first, then clearer as they crossed the pale wash of moonlight. Both carried rifles slung across their chests. Both moved with the confidence of men who had walked this path before. She tracked their stride, measured the distance, calculated the time it would take a bullet to reach them. And still she didn't fire. Because firing meant exposure. Firing meant the others in those vehicles would scatter, hide, or worse, ambush the convoy winding carefully through the alternate path she'd forced them into. No, not yet. Instead, she whispered into her comms. 2 men on foot, armed, east slope, moving toward the old quarry. A pause, then the commander's voice. Copy, hold position, don't engage. Her jaw tightened. She hadn't expected him to grant her permission anyway. But the words pressed against something inside her, that old familiar ache, being ordered to wait, to hold, when she knew action was the only thing between survival and catastrophe. She closed her eyes for half a second. In the dark behind her eyelids, a memory surged. The last night she saw her brother alive. They had been sitting on the porch steps of their childhood home, a storm whispering at the horizon. He had been restless, bouncing his knee, laughing too loud at something that wasn't funny. She had leaned her head against the rail, listening. "You don't have to go," she had whispered. He had smiled, but it hadn't reached his eyes. "You don't get it, sis. Some things, they're bigger than us." And she had felt the sting of helplessness then, the same helplessness that scraped at her now as she lay prone on this ridge, scope fixed, orders binding her hands. The storm had rolled in that night. He had shipped out the next morning. He hadn't come back. Her eyes snapped open. The men below disappeared behind a slope. The vehicles cut their engines, shadows thickening around them. She adjusted her scope, searching, but they had vanished. And with their disappearance came a heavier silence. The kind that pressed against your chest, the kind that told you this wasn't over. She whispered again. "They're gone," vehicles shut down, no further movement. Static hissed. Then the commander, "Stay sharp, they know we're here." Of course they did. She had known it from the moment she spotted that antenna in the grainy satellite footage. From the moment her instincts screamed at her in the valley. This wasn't patrol. This wasn't coincidence. This was a setup. An hour later, the convoy halted at a temporary hold point. A dry riverbed carved into the earth, walls of stone rising high enough to hide the vehicles from the road. The men climbed out, stretching stiff limbs, checking weapons. Low murmurs filled the air, nervous, tired, fragile. She stayed on the ridge above them, lying in the dirt, watching the darkness. The scope had become an extension of her eye. Every shift of shadow, every breath of wind, every tremor of sound etched itself into her nerves. But waiting weighed heavy. The human body wasn't built for stillness. Muscles burned, bones ached, and yet she remained because she had trained herself to live in those moments, where stillness meant survival, where patience was a weapon sharper than any blade. Below, voices carried. She recognized one: Tors, the radio operator. Loud, brash, always filling silence with noise. He was telling another soldier about his daughter's birthday, how he'd missed it last month, how she had cried when he called. His voice cracked when he said it, just a fracture, barely there. But she heard it. And for a fleeting second, Tors wasn't just noise. He was a man bleeding quietly from wounds no one could see. She looked away from her scope, her cheek pressing harder against the cold metal, her breath fogging the eyepiece for a moment. Because that was the part no one prepared you for. Not the waiting, not the danger, but the small reminders of the lives carried silently inside every uniform. The first shot came suddenly. A crack sharp splitting the night. It wasn't hers. The bullet slammed into the dirt near the riverbed, spraying stone, then another, and another, echoes bouncing off canyon walls. Voices erupted below, orders shouted, boots scrambling, engines roaring back to life. She swung her scope toward the ridge opposite hers, and there, like ghosts in the stone, figures appeared, muzzles flashing in bursts of fire, shadows darting between cover. Her body reacted before thought, rifle steady, scope aligned. One breath in, one shot out. The recoil kicked against her shoulder, familiar grounding. Through the glass she saw a figure drop, rifle spinning from his grip. Another target, another shot. She worked with precision. No panic, just rhythm, a heartbeat guiding each pull of the trigger. Below, the convoy roared to life, men scrambling to positions, returning fire. The canyon became a storm of sound, bullets ricocheting, engines growling, voices echoing through stone. But she stayed calm, stayed anchored. Because she had been here before. Too many times. The firefight stretched into minutes that felt like hours. She picked targets carefully, conserving ammunition, choosing only the ones that threatened immediate danger. Between shots she breathed, listened, waited. And in those slivers of quiet, thoughts pressed in. Was this the same group who had taken her brother's unit? The same tactics, the same terrain, the same cruel patience? Or was she just building ghosts from shadows, forcing meaning where there was none? Her chest tightened, but she didn't let the thought distract her hands. Because distraction meant death. The final shots faded. The canyon sank into silence, broken only by the ringing in her ears. Below, the men regrouped, voices sharp but alive. No casualties, not this time. Relief washed through her, in a rush she didn't let show. She lowered her rifle slowly, muscles trembling from hours of tension. Her cheek lifted from the stock, skin raw where metal had pressed too long. Her hands shook once, small, almost invisible. She curled them into fists until the tremor passed. She exhaled long and slow. The commander's voice crackled in her ear. Good eyes, good shots, we move before first light. No thank you, no recognition, just the bluntness of survival. And maybe that was enough. But as she gathered her gear, as she prepared to move with the others deeper into the valley, she couldn't silence the thought. This wasn't over. The men they fought tonight weren't random. The ambush wasn't chance. Someone was watching, someone was waiting. And the deeper they went, the closer they came to the truth she hadn't spoken aloud. That this mission wasn't just theirs. It was hers. Why did the silence feel heavier after the gunfire stopped? It wasn't peace. Not the kind you could breathe in, not the kind that softened muscles or let thoughts rest. This silence had edges, sharp, waiting. She crouched low behind stone, her rifle laid across her knees, eyes sweeping the ridge. The men below were already packing, shoving gear into vehicles, voices terse. They wanted to believe it was over, needed to believe it. But she didn't. Her gaze lingered on the far slope, where shadows still pooled in jagged cracks. The enemy had melted back into the rock, but not all of them had fired. Not all had revealed themselves. She knew what patience felt like. She recognized it now. They weren't gone. Mount up, the commander barked. His voice snapped through the canyon, crisp, practiced, as if sharpness alone could stitch torn nerves. Engines roared back to life. Dust curled into the cold night air. She slid down the ridge, boots finding careful footholds, stones dislodging under her weight. When she reached the riverbed, Torres was leaning against the hood of a vehicle, rubbing his temples with ink-stained fingers. "You all right?" she asked quietly. He startled, glancing at her, then gave a quick, crooked grin. "Yeah, just ringing in the ears. Always feels worse after the shooting stops, you know." She nodded once. She knew exactly. His grin faded as he studied her face, like he wanted to say something more. Instead, he looked away. "Guess you saved our asses again, huh?" It wasn't a joke. Not really. But it wasn't acknowledgement either. More like the half-admission of a man who couldn't quite decide if silence was easier than gratitude. She didn't respond. Just checked her rifle, slid into the vehicle, and closed the door with a dull thud. The convoy began to move. The road wound deeper into the valley, rock walls tightening like jaws. Every shadow became suspect. Every curve could hide a trap. She sat in the back, rifle case balanced against her legs, eyes darting between darkness and reflection. Her breath fogged the glass. Her pulse tapped a quiet rhythm in her throat. The commander's voice cracked over the radio. "Checkpoint in 30 minutes. Hold formation. Stay sharp." She leaned her head against the window, but her eyes didn't close. Couldn't. Instead, her mind wandered where it always went in silence, back to him. Her brother. She could still picture the photograph on her mother's mantel. Him in uniform, arms folded, grin too wide for the moment. She had stood beside him that day, her own uniform still crisp, her rank barely visible. He had teased her for standing so straight, like she was bracing for inspection. "You'll be fine," he had said, tugging her shoulder until she laughed. But he hadn't been fine. And she had promised herself, if she ever faced the same ground, the same traps, she wouldn't make his mistake. She would see what he hadn't. That was why she watched now, with eyes sharper than the others, with silence deeper than their chatter. Because memory was its own weapon. The convoy slowed as the canyon widened. Ahead, the faint glow of a village bled against the horizon. Low houses, narrow streets, lanterns burning where electricity failed. It looked quiet, too quiet. She straightened in her seat. "Why here?" she asked softly, half to herself. The soldier beside her, young, pale under his helmet, shrugged. "Checkpoint, locals friendly. Least that's what the briefing said." She almost laughed. Briefings always said that. As the convoy rolled into the village, dogs barked from rooftops. A shutter creaked open, then slammed shut again. A woman hurried a child indoors. No greetings, no curious stares, only withdrawal. Her chest tightened. She knew this feeling too. It wasn't hostility, it was fear. The kind that arrived when people knew violence was coming and wanted to be far from it. The vehicles parked in the village square, engines cutting one by one. The men dismounted, stretching, checking gear. The commander began issuing orders, his voice low but clipped. She moved to the edge of the square, scanning rooftops, alleys, shadows. Her rifle remained slung, but her hand rested near the strap. A boy watched her from a doorway across the square. Barefoot, eyes too wide for his age. His hands clutched something, wooden, carved, maybe a toy. For a moment, their gazes locked. And she saw it. Not hatred, not curiosity. Warning. The boy's lips parted, but no sound came. He shifted once, almost imperceptibly, then darted inside, door slamming shut behind him. Her stomach dropped. "Something's wrong," she whispered. The commander turned, frowning. "What?" "Locals are hiding. That boy, he wanted to warn us." The commander's jaw tightened, skepticism flashing in his eyes. He had ignored her once already. Now, in front of the men, would he do it again? Before he could answer, a sound split the night. Not a gunshot, not an explosion. A whistle, high, shrill. Then chaos. Gunfire erupted from rooftops. Muzzles flashed in the dark. Bullets tore into vehicles, sparking against metal. Men shouted, scrambling for cover. She dove behind a stone wall, rifle snapping into position. Her scope cut through shadows, found the figure on the rooftop. Mask pulled low, rifle braced. One breath in, one shot out. He fell, body tumbling from the ledge, disappearing into dust. But more replaced him, dozens. The square became a storm, voices screaming, engines roaring, glass shattering. The men fired upward, desperate arcs of muzzle flash against the night. She worked methodically, roof to roof, alley to alley, each target precise, each shot timed between bursts of chaos. But even as she fired, her mind screamed what her voice had warned. This wasn't chance. This wasn't random. They had been expected. Led here. Torres ducked beside her, fumbling with his radio. His face was pale, his hands shaking. They're jamming us, signals dead. She clenched her jaw, the antenna, the trap. She grabbed his shoulder, forcing his gaze steady. Stay alive, that's your only job now. His throat bobbed, he nodded. She pushed forward, slipping between cover, rifle tight. The commander shouted orders somewhere in the chaos, but the square was too fractured, too loud, for them to hold. And in that noise, she realized something colder than fear. This wasn't just an ambush. This was personal. The terrain, the timing, the silence before the storm. It all mirrored her brother's final mission. Her pulse thundered, her breath shortened. Was she chasing ghosts, or had the same hands that ended him now reached for her? The fight stretched into endless minutes. Bodies moved in smoke. Bullets cracked stone. The air stank of gunpowder and sweat. But through it all she held steady. Because she had promised herself. Because she carried him with every pull of the trigger. And because she knew, deep down, this was only the beginning of something larger. When the gunfire finally ebbed, when the last rooftop fell silent, when the men regrouped in the shattered square, she stood with rifle still in hand, heart still hammering. Torres staggered to her side, blood streaking his temple, breath ragged. "We can't stay," he rasped. She nodded, eyes scanning the shadows once more. Because she knew the truth before anyone spoke it. They weren't safe, not here, not anywhere. The trap had only just sprung. And the enemy wasn't done. Not with them. Not with her. Why did the square smell of fire long after the gunfire stopped? Smoke curled between shattered walls, rising from burning debris. A faint orange glow licked at rooftops where bullets had torn through lanterns, where flames had caught dry cloth and old wood. The air stung her throat, acrid, bitter, heavy. She stepped over broken glass, boots crunching, rifle raised. Around her, the men moved like ghosts, mud-streaked, wide-eyed, their nerves frayed. Some muttered under their breath, prayers or curses. Others stared at the bodies scattered across the square, as if they couldn't decide whether to look away or keep watching, just to prove to themselves it had really happened. Her chest tightened. The boy's door was still shut. She forced her gaze forward. She couldn't stop for him, not now. The commander's voice cut through the haze. "Rally up, we're moving out." The men obeyed, weary but automatic, as if obedience could patch the cracks left by chaos. But she lingered, scanning rooftops one last time. The village wasn't silent, it was holding its breath. Somewhere in the distance a dog barked once, then stopped. No voices, no footsteps, only the faint hiss of fire. It wasn't right. None of it was. Back in the vehicle, Torres sat across from her, blood drying at his temple. His hands still shook, though he tried to hide it by fumbling with the radio, checking dials he already knew were useless. She watched him for a moment, then said quietly, "You did good back there." He looked up startled. "Good, I couldn't get a signal out, couldn't call for help, we were blind." "You kept trying," she said, "even when you knew." His mouth opened, then closed. His shoulders slumped. He gave a weak smile, one corner of his mouth twitching up. "Guess that's something." "It's everything," she said. He blinked at her, as if surprised by the steadiness in her voice. Then looked down again, hands tightening around the useless radio. She leaned back against the cold metal wall, closing her eyes for a moment. But behind the lids the boy's face flickered, his wide eyes, his warning. And her brother's voice overlapped it, the way he had sounded the night he left. "Some things are bigger than us." Was this one of them? Or was it personal? Her jaw clenched. The line blurred more with every mile they drove. The convoy left the village behind, headlights cutting thin beams through dark terrain. The road climbed into harsher ground, jagged slopes rising like sentinels. The engines groaned under the weight of stone paths, tires grinding against loose rock. The commander's voice carried through the lead vehicle's radio. We'll take position at outpost Kilo, high ground, secure perimeter before sunrise. Relief rippled through the men. An outpost meant shelter, walls, a pause. But she didn't feel it. Her pulse remained steady, slow, measured, because she knew walls didn't mean safety. Not here. Not against an enemy that already knew where they'd be when they'd move, how they'd think. Her fingers traced the ridges of her rifle, grounding herself in the familiar weight. Survival wasn't walls. Survival was awareness. And she would not let her guard drop. They reached outpost Kilo just as the horizon began to bleed gray with approaching dawn. The structure was little more than concrete and steel, scarred, weathered, half forgotten. A skeleton of a post built years ago, abandoned, now reclaimed for the night. The men spread out, checking corners, clearing rooms, setting up a perimeter. She took the ridge, always the ridge. Her boots crunched gravel as she climbed, rifle slung, breath puffing in the cold air. At the top, she settled into position, the outpost sprawling below her, the valley stretching wide beyond. The sunrise crept slow, pale light spilling across jagged stone, painting the world in harsh relief. Beauty and danger, side by side. She watched, listened, waited. And as the light grew, memories crept with it. Her brother again, but not the porch this time. This memory was from her own first deployment. He had visited her during training, months before his final mission. They'd been standing at the firing range, the sun brutal overhead, rifles heavy in their hands. She had struggled with the long shots then, her scope wobbling, her nerves too raw. He had stood behind her, voice low. It's not about the target, it's about patience. Breathe like the world's not moving. Wait until it feels right. She had grumbled, snapped back that she didn't have time for poetic advice. But he had only smiled. You'll get it, you just don't see it yet. Now, lying on a ridge in a foreign valley, she wondered if he had ever truly believed she would, or if he had been comforting himself too. The ache in her chest tightened. She breathed, waited, saw what others didn't. Below, the men settled into uneasy rhythm. Tours fiddled with the radio again. Others shared rations, some muttering half-jokes about the ambush, laughter brittle as glass. One soldier sat apart, staring at a photograph clutched in his dirt-streaked hands. A wife, a child. She couldn't hear his words, but she saw his lips moving. Saw the way his thumb traced the edge of the paper like it was the only tether he had left. And she knew. Every man down there was carrying something invisible, some weight, some fear, some promise they were desperate to keep. Just as she carried hers. The difference was, she couldn't put hers down when the mission ended. Because hers was buried here, in this valley, in shadows that mirrored her brother's last steps. The first mortar struck without warning. A thunderclap, the ground shook, dirt exploding into the air. Shouts erupted from below. She swung her scope toward the horizon. Smoke trails cut across the sky, arcing from a ridge 2 kilometers out. Her stomach dropped. They weren't just being watched. They were being hunted. Mortar fire, East Ridge, she shouted into her comms. Distance 2 clicks, 3 launchers minimum. The commander's voice snapped back. Return fire, get those tubes up now. Chaos ignited below. Men scrambling, dragging equipment, shouting over the roar of explosions. But she stayed still. Her breath slowed, her heartbeat steadied. Scope aligned, crosshairs fixed. A figure on the far ridge, thin, hunched, adjusting a tube. One breath in, one shot out. The figure dropped. Another replaced him. Another shot. The rhythm took over, recoil, breath, target. Her world shrank to the space between her eye and the scope. Nothing else existed, not the thunder, not the shouts, not the fear. Only patience, only precision. Until the ridge fell silent. When the last mortar cracked into silence, the valley felt different. Not relief, not victory. Confirmation. She lowered her rifle, shoulders aching, cheek raw, eyes burning from the scope's strain. Her suspicion was no longer just instinct. This wasn't random. Someone had drawn them here, to the canyon, to the village, to this outpost. And the pattern matched too perfectly to ignore. Her brother had died in a valley just like this, ambushed, trapped, cut off. She stared at the horizon, at the smoke still drifting from the ridge. This was no accident. It was the same hand, the same mind. And she wasn't just part of this mission anymore. She was standing inside his ghost. Yeah. Her radio crackled, Tor's voice shaky. "We've got wounded, too serious. Commander says hold position, but..." His words broke, static filling the gap. She closed her eyes for a moment, drew one slow breath. The mission was theirs. But the fight was hers. And for the first time, she knew she couldn't just follow orders anymore. Why was she walking into the dark alone? The others were inside the outpost, patching wounds, securing walls, counting ammunition. Orders had been given: hold position, wait for resupply, endure until daylight reinforced them. But she couldn't sit still. The ridge where the mortars had fired still smoked faintly in the distance. It pulled at her like gravity, like a thread tied tight around her chest. She should have stayed, she knew that. Knew what the commander would say if he caught her: reckless, insubordinate, dangerous. But something inside her whispered louder than orders. If you wait, they'll be ready. If you move, you might find answers before they vanish again. She tightened her rifle strap across her shoulder, adjusted her pack, and slipped into the night. The outpost's walls shrank behind her. The valley opened wide. Every step was a choice. Every step was a defiance. And every step carried her deeper into his shadow. The ground crunched beneath her boots, loose rocks shifting under careful weight. The air was cold now, sharp in her lungs, laced with the faint tang of smoke. Above, the stars stretched clear and endless, indifferent to the war crawling across the earth. She moved like she had been trained, low, deliberate, every pause timed to her breath. But training alone didn't guide her. Memory did. Her brother's memory. The way he had walked beside her during their last hike in the mountains back home, his stride unhurried, his voice calm. He had loved the silence of trails, the patience of slow climbs. She had teased him for it then, called him an old man in a young body. Now she copied his rhythm without meaning to, and it steadied her. The ridge loomed closer, black stone against blacker sky. Her stomach tightened. Not fear, not yet. Recognition. The first body lay sprawled at the ridge's base. One of the men she had shot, young, barely more than a boy. His eyes were still open, clouded in the pale moonlight. His rifle lay at his side, mud caked on the stock. She crouched beside him, fingers brushing the ground near his hand. Calluses, not a farmer, not someone dragged unwillingly into this fight. This one had chosen. But why here, why now? Her eyes swept the ridge. More bodies, some fallen where they had fired the mortars, others dragged back toward shadows. Not all accounted for. She climbed higher, stepped slow, rifle ready. Each crunch of gravel felt too loud, too final. At the ridge's crest, she froze. The tubes were still there. Mortars half-loaded, scattered ammunition, gear abandoned in a rush. And etched into the dirt near one launcher, marks, lines, circles, coordinates scribbled fast with a stick or knife. She crouched, tracing them with her gloved hand. Her breath caught. She knew these numbers. Not from this mission, from his. Her brother's final briefing had mentioned coordinates just like these: a ridge, a valley, a position that should have been safe. Until it was. Her vision blurred for a moment, her throat closed. This wasn't coincidence. Whoever had planned tonight had studied the past, had studied him. And now they were studying her. A sound behind her. She swung her rifle up, scope slicing the dark. A figure stepped from the shadows. Not enemy, not local. Tors. His hands lifted fast, breath ragged. It's me, don't shoot. Her finger trembled near the trigger guard before lowering. What the hell are you doing here? He swallowed, shifting his weight nervously. You think you're the only one who saw the pattern. After that square, after those mortars, you think the rest of us can just sit inside and pretend it's fine. His voice cracked. I couldn't. She stared at him, jaw tight. You should have stayed, it's not safe. He gave a humorless laugh. Safe? Where? In that outpost, waiting to be buried under another barrage. Out here, at least I can see it coming. His eyes dropped to the coordinates scratched in the dirt. What is this? Her throat worked, but no words came. She wasn't ready to tell him, not yet. Instead, she said, it's a map. Someone wanted us here, wanted this exact ground. Tor's shoulders sagged. So it's a game, and we're the pieces. She didn't answer, because pieces didn't have choices. But she did. They searched the ridge together, silent except for the crunch of boots and the occasional rattle of loose stone. The gear left behind told its own story, half-empty packs, spare ammunition, a canteen still damp. Whoever had been here had left fast, too fast. And then she found it. Buried under a flat rock, hidden poorly in the rush papers. Notes, sketches of terrain, timelines scrawled in messy script. Her hands shook as she flipped through them. The words weren't in English, but the numbers, the symbols, those she understood. Convoy routes, supply points, patrol schedules. And one word, repeated often, circled hard enough to tear the paper. Kilo. Her breath caught. This wasn't just an ambush. Outpost Kilo had been the destination all along. Tors leaned over her shoulder, his face paling. They knew every move, every checkpoint. She swallowed hard, the taste of ash in her mouth. They wanted us here, she whispered, not just to kill us, to study us. Tors looked at her, eyes wide. Study us for what? She didn't answer, couldn't. Because deep down she already knew. The same way she had known in the valley, the same way she had known with the boy's warning. This was personal. They made their way back to the outpost before dawn, carrying the papers wrapped tight in her pack. The men stirred restlessly inside the walls, exhaustion etched deep in their faces. Some tended wounds by lantern light. Others dozed in corners, rifles clutched even in sleep. The commander stood at the center, arms crossed, jaw hard. His eyes narrowed when he saw her. Where the hell were you? She dropped the pack at his feet, the papers spilling across the ground. Finding this, she said. Her voice was calm, almost too calm. He crouched, flipping through the pages, his expression darkening with every line. When he looked up, his face was pale, his anger muted. Where? He demanded. East Ridge, the mortars. He stood slowly, his gaze hard but not dismissive. Not this time. You shouldn't have gone alone. She met his eyes. You wouldn't have listened if I'd asked. Silence stretched between them, thick, brittle. Finally, he looked away, snapping orders for the men to adjust defenses, prepare for movement. But his voice didn't erase what lingered between them, an unspoken truth. She had seen what he hadn't. Again. Later, when the men tried to sleep in fitful shifts, she sat alone on the wall, rifle across her lap. Tors sat nearby, hunched, silent for once. The valley stretched before them, vast, quiet, waiting. Her eyes traced the horizon, the shadows, the paths she knew they'd have to take. And her thoughts circled one truth, relentless. This mission wasn't survival anymore. It was a message. Whoever orchestrated it wanted her to know. Wanted her to remember. And she did. Every step, every loss, every ghost. The only question was, What would she do when the trap finally closed? The wind picked up, carrying dust across the walls, whispering through cracks in the stone. She tightened her grip on the rifle, her breath steady, her heartbeat calm. Patience, silence, resilience. It was who she was, who she had always been. But patience wasn't enough anymore. This time she would act. Why did the darkness feel heavier tonight? The wind whispered over the outpost walls, but it wasn't just wind. It was a warning. She sensed it in her bones. Something was moving in the valley below. Slow, calculated, not like patrols, not like anyone who was lost or hiding. Her eyes traced every shadow, every ridge, every twist of terrain. She had memorized it all since first setting foot on this mission, but tonight the memory felt sharper, crueler. The notes she had found, those sketches, coordinates, symbols, they were not just information. They were a puzzle. And each move she made felt like a piece sliding into place. Tors sat beside her on the wall, silent but alert. He had stayed near, despite her initial coldness, though she could sense his anxiety like a coiled spring. "You think they'll attack tonight?" he asked quietly. She didn't answer immediately. She didn't want to put words to it, because words could make a plan sound weaker than it was, could make fear sound like a choice. Instead, she scanned the horizon again, muscles tensed under the weight of her pack, rifle ready. "I think they're testing us," she said finally. Her voice was low, measured, watching for reactions, seeing who acts first. He nodded. "And if we act?" She let her eyes drift to the valley. The blackness stretched like an open wound, hiding movement she couldn't yet see. "Then they learn who we really are, and who we protect." Hours passed like minutes. Time stretched thin, fragile. She moved from one watch point to another, checking lines of sight, noting subtle changes. The rustle of grass, the shimmer of metal under moonlight, the distant clink of a rock rolling too far from a slope. Her mind drifted briefly, as it always did, to her brother. He had always taught her to read the terrain, to find rhythm in movement, to see the pattern where others saw chaos. But he hadn't warned her about the cost of seeing it too clearly. She felt it now, the sharp pang of anticipation mixed with dread, the knowledge that she might be the first to fall, or the first to make a move that no one else could undo. The first sign came as a whisper, the faint sound of metal dragging over stone. She froze, breath hitched, fingers tightening on her rifle. Tors was next to her, his pulse suddenly loud in the silence. A figure emerged from the shadows, crouched low, moving deliberately. Not one, but three. Enemy and careful, professionals, not the same young fighters she had seen before. Her heart sank, but not in fear. Determination rose like fire in her chest. She signaled Tors with a tilt of her head. "Stay low, watch, follow my lead." They observed quietly, tracking the intruders as they moved closer to the ridge. Each step the enemy took left a small imprint on the dust, a trail she and Tors memorized immediately. The question lingered, twisting her stomach. Were they here for the outpost or for her? She made her choice in silence. Descending the wall, she kept to shadows, following the enemy's movements from a distance, careful not to alert them. She knew the terrain better than anyone. Every rock, every drop, every hollow she could use as cover. And in this moment, she felt a strange mix of fear and pride. Fear of being discovered, pride in her ability to navigate, to survive. Tors followed, silent, trusting her instinct without question. They circled the intruders, watching them arrange explosives at the base of the ridge, almost ceremonial in their efficiency. "This is bigger than an ambush," Tors whispered, voice tight. "They're setting the stage." She nodded. "A message," she said softly, "for someone." And she felt it, the weight of personal stakes, the echo of her brother's memory. Whoever orchestrated this knew the history, knew her vulnerabilities, and was daring her to respond. Hours blurred as they observed, waiting for the right moment. Her mind raced with calculations, possibilities, what-ifs. Each scenario carried consequences she couldn't fully measure. And yet the thing she knew with absolute certainty was this: she would not let them dictate the outcome. Not now, not ever. Finally, the moment arrived. The intruders paused, adjusting positions, unaware that they were being watched. She whispered to Tors now. A subtle gesture, a nod, a shift in stance signaled him to move. Together they executed a careful disruption, small but effective. A rock rolled down the slope, creating noise at the perfect distance to draw attention. The enemy reacted instantly, guns raised, scanning for the source. But she and Tors were already elsewhere, moving silently through terrain they knew like the back of their hands. The tension was unbearable. Every heartbeat was a drum in her chest, every rustle of grass a potential alarm, every shadow a threat. And yet there was exhilaration too, the kind only those who have stared into darkness and decided to act feel. She couldn't afford to lose focus. Every misstep could cost lives. Every wrong move could collapse the delicate advantage they had carved out. Her thoughts flickered briefly to the men in the outpost, sleeping in uneasy shifts, the faces of those she had grown to trust, and the promise she had made to see them through the night. Then came the sound she had been anticipating. A low rumble, faint at first, growing louder, a vehicle engine, heavy, deliberate, not just a patrol, something bigger. Her stomach tightened. This was no coincidence. "They're bringing reinforcements," she whispered to Tors. His eyes widened, but she didn't falter. "We can't stop them all," she said, "but we can make sure we survive, and we can make sure they remember who we are." Tors swallowed hard. How? Her fingers brushed the notes in her pack, the sketches, the symbols, the timelines. She had memorized them. Every trap, every path, every vulnerable point. "We make the first step count," she said. "We force their hand. We turn their study into their mistake." The attack began quietly, almost imperceptibly. Shadows moved in coordination, but she and Tors had anticipated each movement. Rocks dislodged to create diversions. Small fires lit in brush piles to obscure vision. Every action calculated, deliberate, measured. And through it all, she felt the strange, heavy mix of adrenaline and sorrow. Every step, every choice carried weight, weight she could feel pressing against her chest like a second heartbeat. She thought of her brother again and the lesson he had taught her. Survival isn't just about living. It's about seeing clearly and acting wisely. Hours passed in a blur of strategy and instinct. By dawn, the intruders were forced to retreat, leaving behind the remnants of their plans. Explosives dismantled, equipment scattered, their message incomplete. The ridge was quiet once more, save for the wind and the occasional caw of a distant bird. She and Tors returned to the outpost, carrying with them the evidence of the night's events. Exhausted, covered in dust and sweat, but alive. The men stirred as they returned, eyes widening at the sight of the papers, the scattered gear, the quiet determination in her posture. The commander approached, face pale, expression unreadable. He looked at her, then at Tors, then back at her again. You did this," he said finally, voice low, almost a whisper. She met his gaze. "We survived," she said, "and we learned." A long silence stretched between them, filled with the weight of unspoken understanding. Sometimes courage wasn't loud. Sometimes it wasn't about heroics. Sometimes courage was simply taking the step no one else could. Later, as the first light of dawn brushed the ridge with pale gold, she stood alone on the wall again, watching the valley. The air was still, the dust settled, the wind had calmed. And in that silence she felt a quiet affirmation, a fragile hope. They had survived the night, and for the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to believe that the next step might not be dictated by those who sought to control her fate. Because sometimes, survival was only the beginning. Sometimes dignity didn't speak, it simply acted. And she would act. Why did the silence feel so heavy? The outpost was awake, but only in fragments, some soldiers stirring, some checking weapons, some nursing bruised confidence from the night's confrontation. She stood apart, leaning against the cold metal railing, listening to the hum of generators, the soft creak of doors, the distant shuffle of boots on gravel. Each sound was a pulse she could measure, a rhythm she could anticipate. But it wasn't just the noise that weighed on her. It was the absence of certainty. The enemy had retreated, but why? That question gnawed at her relentlessly. They hadn't just come to test them. They had come for something specific, someone specific. And she could feel it in her chest like a warning. They would return. Yeah. Torres appeared beside her, silent, carrying 2 steaming mugs of coffee. "Thanks," she muttered, taking one. The warmth seeped through her gloves and into her hands, grounding her briefly. "You've been quiet," he said, not accusatory, just observant. She sipped, staring at the horizon. Quiet isn't the same as nothing. He followed her gaze. "No, but it's unsettling. The men are looking at you differently. They're aware." She allowed herself a faint, bitter smile. Awareness can be dangerous, and sometimes it's lonely. Her words hung between them, heavy with unspoken memories. Yeah. The morning passed slowly, methodically. Reports came in, updates, adjustments. She moved among her team with careful efficiency, but her mind was elsewhere. Memories of the night played like film reels she couldn't stop. The enemy's precise movements, the sound of explosives being dismantled, the rhythm of her own heartbeat as she coordinated every step. And then the flash of something else, her brother's last words before the accident that had changed her life. "See clearly, act wisely, protect what matters." Those words had guided her through every mission, but tonight she realized the meaning was evolving. Protection wasn't just about others, it was about herself too. Yeah. Later in the makeshift strategy room, the commander laid out the night's findings. Maps, notes, photographs of footprints, gear left behind, every detail cataloged. "She's right," Torres murmured as they watched. "They were looking for someone, maybe you." The commander didn't respond immediately. He leaned back, eyes narrowing. "They underestimated us, and they underestimated her. That's significant." She didn't look up, not because she didn't care, but because acknowledgement brought a different kind of weight, a weight she wasn't sure she wanted to bear. The men around her exchanged glances, some impressed, some wary, some uncertain. And she felt it, the subtle shift in dynamics, the unspoken acknowledgement that she was no longer invisible. But recognition had a cost. Yeah. She retreated to a quiet corner of the compound later, away from prying eyes. Her hands shook slightly as she checked her rifle, cleaned the barrel with meticulous care. The methodical motion calmed her, but it also reminded her of the stakes. A small note she had tucked in her pocket fluttered against her thigh. Her brother's handwriting, worn with age. "Sometimes the hardest battles are the ones within." She swallowed hard, feeling the truth of it. The physical threats were manageable. The mental ones, the guilt, the grief, the relentless self-doubt, were the battles she fought every day. And tonight, those battles would demand her full attention. Yeah. Footsteps approached. Lieutenant Rivera, one of the senior officers, stopped nearby. His expression was carefully neutral, but she could sense the tension beneath. "Everyone's talking," he said quietly, "about what you did last night." She looked up slowly, meeting his eyes. "Talking doesn't mean understanding," she said. He nodded slightly. "Maybe, but they're curious, inspired. Some of them are afraid because they realize what you're capable of." She considered his words, afraid. That word lingered uncomfortably. Was it fear of her skill, fear of the unknown, or something else entirely? Her mind drifted back to the mission, to the valley, to the moment they had taken the first step. Fear had been a companion then, but it had been tempered by clarity and resolve. Now fear was internal, subtle, creeping into thoughts she hadn't allowed herself to explore. Yeah. That night sleep was impossible. She lay on the cot, the soft hum of the generator a dull background note, eyes wide, mind racing. Images of the intruders returned, faces obscured, hands precise, movements calculated. And underneath it all, the whispering question, why? She reached for her journal, flipping through pages filled with sketches, coordinates, cryptic notes. Every detail catalogued, every observation recorded. And yet, a single question refused to be answered. What do they want from me? She traced a line on the map, eyes narrowing. Somewhere in the folds of terrain, in the shadows she couldn't see, the answer existed. She just had to find it. Yeah. Morning light brought with it no relief. She moved through the camp with purpose, checking defenses, adjusting patrols, speaking quietly with soldiers whose nerves were frayed. Her presence was calm, deliberate, controlled. But inside, the storm raged. She remembered her first deployment, the initial exhilaration of proving herself. And she realized now that proving herself was never the goal. Survival, clarity, and the protection of what mattered, that was the goal. And yet the emotional toll was undeniable. Pride and anxiety collided in a quiet, unrelenting storm. Yeah. Tors found her again near the perimeter, leaning against a sandbag wall. "They'll come back," he said softly, almost as a statement of fact. She nodded. "They will. And when they do, we need to be ready, not just physically, but mentally, emotionally. Every choice counts." He studied her, searching for reassurance. "Do you think we're ready?" She looked out at the ridge, at the valley, at the distant mountains where shadows lingered. "We have to be," she said, "because hesitation isn't an option." And in that moment, she understood something profound. The mission wasn't just about strategy or survival. It was about resilience, about the quiet courage to continue, even when the enemy wasn't the only threat. Yeah. Later, she stood alone at the observation post, watching the valley bathed in pale afternoon light. The silence pressed in, but she welcomed it. It allowed reflection, allowed her to trace her own path, the choices she had made, the sacrifices, the personal debts she carried. Her fingers brushed the notes in her pack, memories of her brother, of training, of every small lesson she had learned. And she realized this mission, these steps, weren't just about survival. They were about honoring a promise, to herself, to him, to the people who depended on her. She felt the weight, but she also felt something else, clarity. Sometimes the hardest battles weren't fought with bullets, they were fought within. And sometimes the quiet moments of reflection were as vital as any strategy, any plan, any step forward. Yeah. As dusk approached, the camp settled into a tentative calm. Soldiers moved with careful efficiency, eyes alert, senses sharpened. She remained at the post a while longer, watching the horizon. The first stars appeared, faint but steady, tiny points of light in the vast darkness. She thought of her brother again, of his voice, of the lessons he had left her. And she understood fully that the true measure of strength wasn't visible in the fight alone. It was in endurance, in quiet resilience, in the courage to face the unknown and still take the next step. Because sometimes survival isn't about winning. It's about standing when everyone expects you to fall. And sometimes dignity doesn't speak. It simply persists. She turned back toward the camp, back toward the lives that depended on her, and took that next step. Why did the night feel different this time? The wind carried a chill that cut through the layers of fabric, through the concrete walls, through the tension that had gripped the outpost for days. She stood at the edge of the perimeter, eyes scanning the darkness. Every shadow seemed alive, every sound magnified. It was a familiar fear, but tonight it was sharper, focused. A predator's patience met with her own. The enemy would come again, she knew it, And this time she had to anticipate more than their movements. She had to anticipate herself, her doubts, her hesitations, her instincts.
Yeah.
Tors joined her, breaking the silence without speaking. They didn't need words. Their presence alone was reassurance. She felt it, a subtle tether between them, a quiet trust forged in the fires of previous battles. "Ready?" he asked, voice low, careful. She didn't answer immediately. She tilted her head toward the horizon, feeling the pulse of the terrain, the invisible rhythm of the approaching danger. Finally, she said, "Always." The word wasn't boastful. It was deliberate. It was a statement of commitment to herself, to her team, to the people who relied on them.
Yeah.
The hours stretched like an eternity. Every step, every shift of shadow, every whisper of wind was catalogued, analyzed, anticipated. Her heart beat with measured intensity. The hum of the generator, the soft rustle of leaves, the distant cry of a lone animal, everything became part of her consciousness. She remembered her brother's words echoing in her mind: "See clearly, act wisely, protect what matters." It wasn't just about action tonight. It was about presence. Every decision mattered, every breath carried consequence.
Yeah.
Then movement, a flash, almost imperceptible. Her senses sharpened, muscles coiled. She signaled Tors with a subtle nod. He understood instantly. The enemy approached, silent, methodical, deliberate. Not just intruders, but hunters. And for the first time, she felt the full weight of anticipation transform into clarity. She took a slow breath, grounding herself. The past, the fears, the uncertainty, they didn't vanish, but they were tools now, sharpened edges she could wield.
Yeah.
The confrontation was precise, surgical. Every decision counted. Every instinct mattered. She moved through the darkness with careful control, leading her team with silent authority. The enemy advanced, unaware that they were being read, analyzed, anticipated at every turn. The battle was not about violence. It was about perception, about understanding, about anticipating the unpredictable. Tors moved beside her, covering angles, communicating through subtle gestures. Together, they became more than individuals. They became a single, coherent force of intention and clarity.
Yeah.
She remembered the faces of her team, the young soldiers who had looked to her for guidance, the ones who had doubted themselves, the ones who had grown in the shadow of uncertainty. And she realized fully that leadership was never about personal glory. It was about presence, about giving others the courage to act, the space to survive, the permission to believe in themselves. Her brother's words came again, gently, insistently: "Protect what matters." Tonight, that mattered more than anything.
Yeah.
The enemy faltered. Confusion crept into their rhythm, subtle but undeniable. She sensed it, adjusted, exploited it, not out of malice but out of necessity. The mission unfolded like a carefully constructed symphony. Every step deliberate, every movement calculated, every pause meaningful. And in the chaos, she felt a strange serenity, a strange, hard-earned peace.
Yeah.
Finally, the silence returned. The enemy had withdrawn, leaving behind evidence of their presence but no conquest. The outpost was intact, the team unbroken, the mission complete. She lowered herself to the ground, fatigue pressing into every muscle, every joint. She closed her eyes and let the night envelope her. The battle was over, but the reflection had just begun.
Yeah.
Tors crouched beside her. "You did it," he said softly. She shook her head, a faint, weary smile forming. "We did it, not me, we." He nodded. "Still, you led, you held, you stayed present." She didn't respond immediately. Her mind traced the journey that had brought her here, the sacrifices, the doubts, the losses, the tiny victories that no one else would notice. She thought of her brother, of the lessons he had imparted, of the quiet resilience that had become her anchor. And she understood fully that true strength was not measured by skill alone, but by endurance, by empathy, by the courage to face the unknown and still move forward.
Yes.
Morning arrived quietly. The outpost breathed with cautious relief. Soldiers moved with careful energy, patching minor damages, checking equipment, exchanging tired but genuine smiles. She walked among them, observing, connecting, listening. Every small gesture mattered, the way a hand rested briefly on a shoulder, the way a laugh cut through tension, the way someone allowed themselves to feel safe again. She understood that survival was not just physical, it was emotional, it was moral, it was human.
Yes.
Later she stood on the ridge, overlooking the valley where shadows had danced and enemies had crept. The sun rose in streaks of amber and gold, illuminating every scar, every footprint, every mark of the previous night. Her fingers traced the edges of her notes, the maps, the observations. Everything mattered, everything carried meaning. And yet in that moment she realized something profound. The greatest victories were often silent, unseen, uncelebrated. Because sometimes courage does not announce itself. Sometimes dignity does not speak, it simply acts.
Yes.
She felt a hand on her shoulder, a gentle, grounding presence. Tors, he didn't speak, he didn't need to. Together they watched the valley, the sunrise, the quiet persistence of life after chaos. Her mind drifted back to the first step, the moment that had changed everything. The moment she had been underestimated, dismissed, ignored. The moment that had tested her resolve and forced her to confront herself fully. She understood fully that every choice, every step, every act of quiet resilience had led to this moment. And she knew that the journey wasn't over, not for her, not for her team, not for anyone who relied on presence, clarity, and courage in the face of uncertainty.
Yes.
She turned back toward the camp, each step deliberate, each breath measured. In the quiet aftermath, she allowed herself something rare, a fleeting sense of pride, not loud, not boastful, not celebrated, quiet, persistent, real. She knew the enemy would return someday, that challenges would arise, that the unknown would continue to press against her limits. But she also knew this. She was ready. Her team was ready. And most importantly, she was no longer invisible to them, to herself, to the world. The valley stretched before her, vast and unyielding. The light touched the ridges, the peaks, the shadows. And in that light she felt something she had not felt in a long time, hope. Hope tempered by experience, hope grounded in clarity, hope carried forward by courage and dignity.
Yes.
She paused at the edge, looking down once more. The memory of the first step lingered, but it no longer held fear. Instead, it held meaning, purpose, a reminder that the smallest choices, the quietest actions, could reverberate in ways that were invisible but powerful. And as the sun fully emerged, washing the valley in gold, she whispered softly, almost to herself. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak, it simply acts. She turned back to the camp, ready for the next step, ready for the next challenge, ready for whatever the horizon held. And in that moment, everything felt possible.